You don't want to buy a house in 2024 unless you can handle this. We're going to look at this house right here. And before we get into the house, we're also going to be looking at a handful of things of what's going on in the market. So if you are thinking about buying a house in 2024, you may want to pay attention. This house right here, it was sent to us by one of our subscribers. This couple bought this house at the end of 2022. They held on to it for less than a year, tried to sell it. They relisted it. So they originally bought it at $835. And then they turn around, try to sell it a year later at $790. They couldn't sell it at $790, and they just went under contract with a contingency to short sell it. Now, in case some of you guys are wondering where I'm hiking at, you can see downtown Boise there. I'm at Camelback Park, a little out of breath, but it's a beautiful morning, and I had to get on here because more and more people are starting to get into the market and start buying. Now, the interesting thing about this is they're selling it for short of $100,000 or more in the less than 2 years. And this is why we've been talking about you don't want to be buying a house in 2024 unless you know for sure you're going to stay there, because you cannot go out and buy a house and rent it out if you don't like it. You can't. It just doesn't make sense. It is so much cheaper right now to rent a house than it is to buy a house. And so you have to be fully committed to holding on to that house for the long term. You can't buy it with the expectations of, well, if I just don't want it, I can sell it, because so many people are stuck and they're having to sell it for a short. We're also seeing a lot of people who bought over the last couple of years are regretting it. So we are seeing more and more buyers enter at least our market from out of state. We just had a client sell their house to somebody in Michigan who's never lived here before. They never saw it. They bought it all virtually. And then they're not even going to move into it for a couple months. And so here's the thing. If these people from Michigan end up moving here and not liking it, because they never walked through it, they had the inspection, but that was about it, what's going to happen? Like, what are the choices going to be if they are going to end up selling it in the long run? The other thing that you got to keep in mind is more people are being called back to work right now. They're being called back to the office, and they aren't getting the luxury of being able to work remote or not as remote. And we're seeing this with different people in my sphere where they're being called back to work, called back to Amazon, called back to Google headquarters, and they can't necessarily work remote like they used to. Now, this isn't widespread, but then we also have this mix, right? The Facebook Facebook or Meta, their data center has opened up, and they are bringing people in and hiring people. So there is a hiring coming in on that. But a mass majority of people who live here aren't able to afford. Now, I want to stress afford, because some might be approved to buy it, but they can't afford it. And what we're getting ready to see is all these people who bought in 2021 on these 2-1 buy downs, they're now almost paying full price, right? They're almost paying the full 6.5-7% that they started out with, maybe a 5%. And so just in conversation with different people who are expecting to be able to refinance by now, their payment has jumped up $400 to $800 a month because that 1 or 2% interest rate jumped up. And so you really don't want to buy a house unless you know for sure you can afford it. And when we're talking about affordability is just, it's not even here in the Boise market unless you have a lot of cash or you're buying all cash. Because keep in mind, you have to be able to stay in that house, because you cannot turn around and rent it with today's rates, with today's home prices. And so you have to be committed. So if you can't be committed to a house, don't buy a house. The other thing that you have to be committed to is work. Because what's going to happen if you end up losing your job and now you can't afford the payments, right? You got squeezed. I was talking to another agent with another company the other day, and just talking about how his business going, what's going on in his world. He's been in the industry since 2006. And something that he was just sharing with me is like, you know, with prices and interest rates the way they are, none of my clientele can really afford. You might have a couple here and there, but everybody's getting priced out of the market because interest rates are so high and they're staying high. But yet we still hear lenders touting interest rates are going to drop by this time next year. Interest rates are going to drop. But we've heard that for how many years? I think we've heard that for 2 years now, that then it's the next year that the interest rates are going to drop. It's the next year that the interest rates drop, but we haven't seen that yet. And so we really just want to pay attention to that. So if you are going to jump in, you want to make sure that you are buying and you're okay with the interest rate you're going to get, knowing that there might be a good chance that you're not going to be able to refinance. And if you can't refinance, well, you just have to be okay with that interest rate. Right now, the amount of equity that you're building on a 7% interest rate is very minimal. I mean, we're talking about maybe $3,000 a year is what you're building in equity when you're through your monthly payment because of how high interest rates are, assuming that you have a loan of right around $500,000. And so don't get into the market thinking, oh, I'm just going to build equity, because that is not necessarily the case. Now, we could see a little bit more price increases, but the thing is that people are missing out when we're looking at maybe the median sales price going up is the amount of incentives that builders or that even sellers are having to give up to keep that purchase price elevated. And so you're not even getting the full median sales price, right? So right now we're seeing that the median sales price here in Ada County and Cannon County is on the rise again. Month over month, it's on the rise. But when you actually look at how much money these buyers are getting in incentives, it's an insane amount. I mean, we're talking about some in the upwards of $25,000, $30,000 in seller concessions or seller incentives. And so even though, let's say the house is bought at $550,000, the seller is actually giving $30,000 of that back just to help the buyer be able to afford it. So really the sales price should reflect $520 rather than $550, but we're not seeing that. Which leads me to the next thing is, if you're gonna buy a house, you wanna be happy and content in it for the long haul, right? The days of being able to buy a house, live in it for 4 or 5 months, turn around and sell it, they're gone. Like, you aren't able to do that, at least anymore in our market for the time being, because we're seeing, again, more and more people who have lost equity. I mean, think about the person who bought 2 years ago in a new construction. Maybe they bought new construction, but now these builders have had to drop their prices because the amount of inventory, we have 3 months supply of inventory, and that's including the highest price point to the lowest price point of inventory that's currently listed on the market. That doesn't include the ones that are finished but not listed, or the ones that are currently under construction. And so these are all factors that you really need to consider, is if you are going to be buying a house, you need to be in it for the long haul. You're not going to be able to just turn around and sell it if you're not happy. And so you really got to think through, even if somebody's telling you there's another buyer interested in this house, don't make you do irrational things like waive the appraisal or waive an inspection. Those are things that you definitely do not want to do, because those people who waived the inspection, those people who waived appraisal, I think are regretting it now as they're having more and more problems. I mean, I'll give you an example. We had a client, they had an inspection, and through the inspection, now you wouldn't have seen this by just walking through the house, but through the inspection, they found out that the bathroom had had an active leak and has been leaking for who knows how long, to where the floorboard was now all squishy, right? But if you waived the inspection, you wouldn't have been able to get a credit. Like these buyers, because they were savvy, they were gonna do the work themselves, they were able to get around a $2,500 credit, and they were gonna be able to replace the subfloor, replace the toilet, replace the floors, and they felt they could do it all in that price point. But if you waived the inspection because you got excited because somebody else was gonna buy the house, maybe somebody else was maybe gonna take it out from underneath you, you would have missed out on that, and that could have been $2,500. But that $2,500, maybe if you had to hire a company, could have turned into $8,000. And so these are things that you really want to consider, and you don't want to end up being one of those buyers that regret it, who end up buying a lemon or buying a property that just doesn't make sense for them. Another thing that I want to bring up so that you do not regret buying a house is you got to ask yourself why. Why do I want to buy a house? Why do I want to buy a house versus renting? Because again, renting is about 1/2 the cost it is to buy a house. And I think that number is going to spread even further if we see interest rates continue to stay high, because there's no reason right now for the Treasury to go down. But let's just say the interest rates stay high. And if the interest rates are staying high, then you really have to ask yourself, like, why do I want to pay twice as much for a house? Is it because you want to be able to do something to the house? You want to stop having to be at the mercy of moving? If you do want to stop being at the mercy of moving, then yeah, maybe it is a good time to buy, but you have to consider all the factors. Because keep in mind, although you're paying half the cost in rent, you're also saving on your fixes, right? So let's say you're buying a used house, the AC goes out, the furnace goes out, and now you're out another $5,000 to $12,000, maybe even $16,000, depending on where your price point is. And if you're out that money, you would be out that money if you bought the house and you're paying twice as much as what the rent would be. But if you're renting and those things go out, guess who's on the hook? That's right, the landlord. The landlord is gonna have to be the one to replace those units for you. So you really, really gotta consider it. And you really gotta ask yourself, do I want this house? Do I want to be a homeowner bad enough? And this is hard for me to say because I'm an agent, right? I'm a broker, owner of a real estate firm. But I really want my clients to think through, should I be jumping into the housing market right now? Because I don't want to have that phone call later where they say, hey, you know what? I bought a house and now I want to sell it. And then I have to tell them, well, I know you want to sell it, but you can't. You can't sell it because you don't have the equity and you can't cover the closing costs. The other thing that you have to consider, especially with this NAR settlement going through, is here in August is the new deadline. It was July, but now it's August. They want to remove the compensation agreement from the MLS. So now on the MLS, you're no longer going to be able to offer compensation. It doesn't mean that sellers can't offer compensation, but I think some sellers are not going to want to. And you're going to have to go into the housing market knowing that you're going to have an additional closing cost if that seller isn't willing to pay for your agent. Now, what would that look like? How does that work out? Well, here, when we help clients buy commercial property and there isn't compensation offered, because a lot of times there's not, you have to structure the offer in a way that says, hey, this offer is based off of you paying my client X amount of dollars. And so you have to go into that understanding that there might be an additional cost of you paying for the buyer's agent. And, you know, I actually agree with this lawsuit. I am in favor of this lawsuit because I think there's been so many times where there's a bad agent on the other side, or I've heard so many people tell me, man, I had a bad agent and they didn't fight for me. They didn't schedule anything. I had to do all the work. I found the house. I did this, I did that. And they just had a very, very bad experience with that agent. And the thing is, probably because they didn't think twice about hiring that agent, right? And when you go to sell a house, you know that there's an expense coming out of your pocket. And when you know that expense is coming out of your pocket, you think twice about who you're going to hire. What kind of marketing strategy do they have? What kind of reach do they have? How are they at negotiating? How are they at this and that? And I think that's what's going to change here with this NAR lawsuit is I hope it makes buyers really think about who they're going to hire. And it's going to weed out the non-professionals, the people who aren't really actively doing it, the people who aren't actively helping their clients. And so the whole, I don't even know why I need an agent because I did all the work, goes away because we get rid of the lazy agents and get the professionals in it who are doing it and are hard. And I think part of this is when you go to hire your agent, you got to make sure that the agent you're going to work with is going to be worth what you're paying. And keep in mind, like, this is going to be a negotiating thing, right? Like, some agents might say, I'm only going to work for a 3%, but other agents might work for 1%. Other agents might work for a flat fee. But that's for you to negotiate and make sure you understand, why am I hiring you? What are the benefits you're bringing me for hiring you? And those are the questions that I think you should be asking, is like, how good are you at getting me a price, right? Like, we had a conversation and somebody asked me, which was a very solid, how do you feel about offering lower than the list price on a house? And which I think is a valid offer, because some agents are so concerned about, oh, I got to keep up my reputation, I can't be that lowball agent, which, you know, there is something to be said about that. But at the end of the day, your agent is there to work for you and negotiate for you and work on your behalf. And if they're afraid to write an offer that you've asked, now within, I gotta say, within reason, right? If they're afraid to work for you, then you should really be thinking twice. And you need to be asking your questions like, how do you feel about negotiating? Tell me a time that you negotiated. What's the most you've been able to negotiate off of a sales price? Tell me a time that you advised a client not to come in low, and tell me a time that you did have them come in low. And then work through that, right? Because you need to know that. What are your systems in place? What is the value that you're going to provide for me, because I'm going to be paying you this? And these are the questions that you should be asking your agent, and ask them, what is that value? Why am I going to be paying you this much for this house?